On a quiet evening inside the execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit, a man with a long gray beard lay strapped to a gurney. A chaplain placed his hand on the prisoner's chest and whispered a prayer. Moments later, the warden asked the question that always comes last. "Do you have a final statement?" The man looked through a small glass window where his wife stood watching. His voice cracked. "I don't want to leave you, baby. I love you. See you when you get there." Then he mouthed a kiss. A few minutes later, the drugs began flowing into his veins. 17 minutes after that, he was dead. But here's the disturbing part. This man wasn't executed for killing a stranger. He was executed for killing his own mother. And the story of how their relationship spiraled into violence is one of the most unsettling family tragedies to come out of East Texas. Before we dive in, quick favor, if you enjoy true crime stories that uncover the dark truths behind real cases, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you think, and you won't miss the next story. Now let's rewind to where this nightmare began. The victim in this case was Carolyn Click, a 62-year-old woman living in the small East Texas town of Whitehouse, Texas. Neighbors described her as friendly, talkative, and the type of person who believed families should stick together no matter what. And that belief would ultimately cost her everything. Carolyn's relationship with her son Tracy had been troubled for years. Arguments, violence, police calls. According to testimony from neighbors, the fights between them could get explosive. One witness even said there had been an earlier incident where Tracy beat his mother so badly she was left barely alive. Yet, despite all of that, Carolyn still welcomed him back into her home in October of 2003. Friends didn't understand why, but to Carolyn, it was simple. He was her son, and she believed living together again might finally repair their broken relationship. Unfortunately, that hope didn't last long, because almost immediately after Tracy moved in, the fighting started again. And this time, the tension inside that home would lead to something far worse. Neighbors later told investigators that arguments between mother and son were almost daily events. Raised voices, doors slamming, threats that could be heard from outside. At one point, Carolyn even confided in a neighbor that Tracy had said something deeply disturbing. He allegedly told people he just wanted to shut her up. Those words would later echo through the courtroom. Despite the tension, Carolyn tried to keep the peace, but by November 2003, things had reached a breaking point. After another heated argument, she reportedly told Tracy he needed to move out. That demand would turn out to be the final straw, because later that same day, Carolyn Click vanished. And what investigators would uncover next shocked the entire community. When Carolyn suddenly disappeared, neighbors became concerned almost immediately. Something didn't feel right. Her son Tracy was still around the property, but Carolyn herself was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, police began asking questions. At first, Tracy gave several different versions of what had happened, but one detail kept appearing in his story. He said that on the night his mother died, he had come home drunk. An argument broke out between them. The shouting escalated. Then the fight turned physical. According to Tracy's later statement to police, he wrapped his hands around his mother's neck during the struggle. He claimed he only meant to silence her, but the pressure didn't stop, and eventually, she stopped breathing. Tracy later told investigators he didn't even realize she was dead until the next day. But instead of calling for help, instead of telling anyone what had happened, he made a decision that would turn a tragic death into a horrifying crime. Because what he did next would make the case even darker. Behind Carolyn Click's mobile home was a small patch of backyard. It looked ordinary, quiet, but investigators would soon discover it was hiding a terrible secret. After realizing his mother was dead, Tracy dug a hole in that backyard. Then he buried her body there. For days, no one knew the truth. But that wasn't the only disturbing part. Authorities later revealed that during this time, Tracy had been spending his mother's money. Prosecutors said he used it on drugs and alcohol while her body lay buried just a few feet away. Eventually, investigators uncovered the grave. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community of Whitehouse. A son had killed his mother and then tried to hide it in the very yard where she lived. But the legal case that followed would take an unexpected turn, because prosecutors weren't just seeking a murder conviction, they wanted the death penalty. And their reasoning was something many people didn't expect.
In Texas law, not every killing qualifies for the death penalty. To be sentenced to death, a person must be convicted of capital murder. That usually involves things like killing a police officer or multiple victims. But in Tracy Beatty's case, prosecutors used a different legal path. They argued that when Tracy returned to the home after being told to leave, he was technically committing a burglary. And if someone kills another person during a burglary in Texas, it can qualify as capital murder, even if the victim is a family member, even if the killer had previously lived in the home. That legal argument changed everything, because it meant Tracy Beatty was suddenly facing the most severe punishment the state could deliver. And the case was about to get even more complicated, because Tracy's lawyers claimed something else was going on inside his mind, something they said made executing him deeply wrong. As Tracy's appeals began, his defense team raised serious concerns about his mental health. Experts who examined him described a deeply troubled psychological condition. One expert reportedly concluded that Tracy was living inside what they called a complex delusional world. According to those evaluations, Tracy believed prison staff were part of a massive conspiracy against him. He even claimed correctional officers were using some type of device in his ear to torment him with threatening voices. His attorneys argued these symptoms suggested severe mental illness, and they wanted additional testing to determine whether he might be intellectually disabled. Under U.S. law, individuals who are intellectually disabled cannot be executed, but the courts pushed back. Judges pointed out that these claims had not been raised during earlier stages of the appeals process, and prison officials insisted certain security rules, like keeping inmates handcuffed during evaluations, had to remain in place. The legal battle dragged on for years. Multiple execution dates were scheduled, multiple delays followed. But eventually, the case reached its final stop, the Supreme Court of the United States, and their decision would determine whether Tracy lived or died. On the morning of his scheduled execution, Tracy Beatty's lawyers made one last attempt to stop it. They asked the Supreme Court to intervene. Their argument centered on the same issue they had raised before. They said Tracy had never received a full mental health evaluation, and that without it, executing him could violate constitutional protections. But the court declined to step in. With that decision, all legal options were exhausted. The execution would move forward. Later that evening, Tracy Beatty was escorted into the execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit. Witnesses watched through a glass window. A chaplain prayed, and the final question was asked, "Do you have a last statement?" What happened next left the room silent. As he lay strapped to the gurney, Tracy Beatty struggled to speak. His voice trembled. He looked toward his wife, watching from the other side of the glass. "I don't want to leave you, baby. I love you." Then he thanked several fellow death row inmates. "I love you, brothers. See you on the other side." Moments later, the lethal injection began. Witnesses said he took a couple of deep breaths as the sedative took effect. Soon after, he began to snore. 17 minutes later, a physician pronounced him dead. Just like that, the life of Tracy Lane Beatty was over. But the case left behind a complicated legacy. Some people saw justice for a murdered mother. Others questioned whether someone suffering severe mental illness should face the ultimate punishment. Either way, the story remains one of the most disturbing family tragedies to ever end inside the Texas execution chamber. In the end, this case wasn't just about crime. It was about a broken relationship between a mother and her son, a woman who kept believing things would get better, and a conflict that spiraled into a moment of irreversible violence. Today, Carolyn Click is remembered by neighbors as someone who never stopped loving her child, even when things became dangerous. And that heartbreaking truth is what makes this case so unsettling, because sometimes the darkest stories don't begin with strangers. They begin inside our own homes.